What happens when one of Hollywood's most famously level-headed actors finally reaches his absolute breaking point, and does it on live television for millions to witness? What we're about to show you isn't just another celebrity mishap or an awkward interview gone slightly off the rails. No, this is the moment Jason Bateman, an actor known for his cool-headed charm, his calm delivery, and his razor-sharp sense of humor, completely lost his composure during what should have been a routine promotional interview on The View. This wasn't your garden variety talk show tension. This wasn't one of those playful disagreements that hosts love to spin into viral clips. This was something else entirely, something raw, unfiltered, and shockingly real. What unfolded in that studio wasn't just a meltdown. It was a verbal takedown so precise, so unexpected, that it left the hosts, the audience, and even the production crew frozen in stunned, breathless silence. Before we dive into the footage, before we show you the exact moment where everything snapped, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us what you think pushed Jason to his explosive breaking point. Because trust me, after hearing the full story, everyone is going to have an opinion. It all began like any other Tuesday morning on The View. The audience filed in, the cameras powered up, and the hosts slipped into their familiar routine: light jokes, quick discussions, and upbeat introductions. Jason Bateman had been invited to promote his latest Netflix project, a darkly comedic thriller already generating buzz online. He arrived at the studio early, dressed casually but polished, carrying the same steady confidence and subtly mischievous charm that had made him a favorite guest on talk shows for nearly 2 decades. If you've ever seen a Jason Bateman interview, you know exactly what to expect. He's calm, he's composed, he's quietly funny in a way that feels effortless. He never raises his voice, never appears rattled, and never, ever lets tension show. Producers love him precisely for that reason. He's safe, dependable, and guaranteed to make a segment smooth and engaging. And that's exactly the demeanor he brought to the studio that morning. Smiling politely, shaking hands with the hosts, joking lightly with the crew, Jason looked relaxed, ready, and entirely unbothered. There was absolutely no sign of the storm that was coming. From the moment the interview began, everything appeared perfectly normal. The hosts asked him about his new project, his experience working with a high-profile cast, and his thoughts on taking on darker roles after the success of Ozark. Jason responded with thoughtful, measured answers in that dry, understated style his fans love. The audience laughed at his witty asides. The energy felt steady, even predictable, but beneath the surface, something else was building, something no one in the studio could sense yet. It started with one question. A question that, on the surface, seemed harmless but carried a subtle edge, the kind of edge Jason had grown used to dodging in Hollywood. At first, he brushed it off with a smile. Then came another question, slightly more pointed, slightly more personal. Again, he handled it smoothly, though his smile tightened just a little at the corners. Then came the third question, the one that crossed the line. It was phrased casually, almost innocently, but its intention was clear. It attacked his professionalism, his integrity, his role behind the scenes. It hinted at rumors that Jason had chosen to ignore for months, believing they would fade away. Instead, they had been resurrected live on air, right in front of a national audience. The shift was immediate, subtle, and chilling. A small pause, a faint narrowing of his eyes, a stillness in his expression that didn't belong to the charming talk show version of Jason Bateman. The hosts didn't notice it at first. The audience didn't either, but if you were watching closely, if you knew Jason well, you could see the moment the switch flipped. What followed next is what people would replay millions of times online, analyzing every word, every gesture, every breath. Jason leaned forward ever so slightly, his voice steady but now carrying an unmistakable edge, sharp, precise, and laced with frustration he had kept buried for far too long. He didn't yell. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't sidestep or soften the impact. Instead, he delivered a takedown, cold, controlled, and devastating. The hosts sat back in shock. The audience fell silent, the chatter evaporating instantly. Even the camera operators froze, unsure whether to zoom in or pull back. This wasn't a slip. This wasn't a momentary lapse. This was deliberate. A man who had been pushed too far finally snapping, finally saying what he had held back for years, and the silence that followed. It wasn't awkward, it wasn't uncomfortable, it was absolute, the kind of silence that makes a studio feel like it's shrinking, the kind that lingers long after the camera's cut, the kind that leaves a permanent mark. Jason Bateman, Hollywood's calmest, most composed figure, had reached his breaking point, and the world had just watched it happen. The pre-interview chatter was light and easy, the kind of casual, professional small talk you'd expect from a man who had spent decades navigating press junkets, morning shows, and show couches with effortless grace. Jason Bateman had done hundreds, maybe thousands, of these appearances. He knew the rhythm, the pacing, the energy, and that morning nothing seemed out of the ordinary. "Jason, welcome back to The View," Whoopi Goldberg said as the cameras began to roll, her warm, familiar smile setting what everyone assumed would be the tone for the entire segment. Her voice carried that soothing calm that had anchored the show for years. "Always a pleasure to have you here." "Thanks for having me, Whoopi," Jason replied, settling into his chair with that signature ease, the kind of quiet confidence that made him instantly likable the moment he appeared on screen. "Great to be back." For the first few minutes, everything proceeded like a well-oiled machine. Scripted questions, rehearsed talking points, light banter, exactly the kind of promotional fluff that rarely made headlines but always filled airtime. He talked about his new Netflix series, A Few Behind, the scene stories, nothing controversial, nothing unpredictable, just the safe, polished interview style that both Jason and the hosts could perform in their sleep. Sarah Haynes chimed in with a cheerful question about his co-stars. Alyssa Farah Griffin asked about filming locations and whether the cast had bonded off screen. Sunny Hostin added a thoughtful inquiry about the show's themes and the emotional depth of certain episodes. Jason answered each one flawlessly. Witty, composed, charming. The audience chuckled. The hosts nodded. Everything was smooth. Then Joy Behar leaned forward. It wasn't a big movement. Not at first. Just a small shift of her weight, a slight narrowing of her eyes, but for anyone familiar with Joy's on-air persona, it was the telltale signal, the spark before the explosion, the prelude to a moment everyone would later replay frame by frame. "Jason, I have to ask," Joy began, her tone carrying that unmistakable edge, the kind of edge that made regular viewers of The View sit up straight because they knew exactly what it meant. "Trouble. Serious trouble. Your show deals with some pretty heavy political themes," she continued, "so I'm curious about your personal political leanings. Are you one of those Hollywood liberals, or do you lean a little more conservative?" The question dropped into the room like a live grenade. This wasn't the direction the producers had prepared for. This wasn't on the cards, and it certainly wasn't the kind of topic Jason Bateman ever discussed publicly. Something Joy knew very well. A visible shift passed through the studio. A tightening, a stillness. The audience grew quiet, sensing something wasn't quite right. Jason's smile flickered, just for a moment, so quick, so subtle that the average viewer might have missed it entirely. But it was there, a tiny crack in the polished facade, a shadow crossing an otherwise steady demeanor. "Well, Joy," Jason began carefully, his media training sliding into place like a shield. His tone was calm, measured, diplomatic. "I try to keep my personal politics separate from my work. I think audiences appreciate when actors don't lecture them about how to think or vote." It was a textbook answer, clean, safe, professional. But Joy wasn't satisfied. "Oh, come on." She waved her hand dismissively, leaning in even closer. "You expect us to believe that? Your show is dripping with political commentary. You clearly have opinions, so why hide them? Are you scared of upsetting people? Or are you only outspoken when it benefits your career?" The atmosphere tightened again, this time sharper, heavier. A couple of audience members exchanged uneasy glances. Even the crew behind the cameras shifted uncomfortably, sensing that Joy was pushing past the normal boundaries, heading directly into territory guests typically avoided and hosts usually respected. Jason kept his posture steady, but his eyes changed, just slightly. The softness faded, the humor dimmed, his jaw tensed ever so mildly. He took a breath, slow, controlled, the kind of breath people take when they're trying very hard to stay composed. "Joy," he began, still calm, but with a noticeable firmness now woven into his tone. "I'm here to talk about my work, not to get into political debates. I don't think that's what your viewers are tuning in for." Joy smirked. "Oh, I think they're tuning in for honesty, actually." Whoopi glanced toward her co-hosts, clearly sensing the direction this was heading and not liking it. Sarah shifted in her seat. Alyssa blinked. Sunny raised her eyebrows in quiet disbelief. Everyone could feel the shift now. Joy wasn't just poking, she was pushing hard, and Jason Bateman, the famously calm, famously composed man who always played the rational character in any room, was being cornered on live television. His fingers tightened slightly around the arm of his chair, his shoulders drew inward, and that easygoing smile, the trademark Bateman grin that had charmed audiences for decades, finally, unmistakably disappeared. Something had cracked, something real, something raw, and everyone, hosts, crew, audience, felt it immediately. What happened next would send shockwaves through the studio, dominate social media for days, and become one of the most talked about moments in The View's long history. Because Jason Bateman didn't stay calm, he didn't stay quiet, and he didn't sit back and let Joy continue. He snapped. "That's such a cop-out answer." Joy snapped, her tone dripping with challenge. "Everyone in Hollywood has opinions. You can't seriously expect us to believe you don't have thoughts about what's happening in this country." The studio grew noticeably quieter. The air felt charged. Even viewers at home would later describe this moment as the instant everything shifted from light conversation to something far more volatile. "Of course I have thoughts," Jason replied, his voice still controlled, still calm, but now carrying a faint edge, like a guitar string pulled just a little too tight. "I just don't think my job as an entertainer is to impose those thoughts on other people." It was a reasonable answer. A balanced one, the kind of answer most actors lean on to avoid political landmines, but Joy wasn't interested in balance. Her laugh cut through the air, sharp, sarcastic, and unmistakably mocking. "So you're saying you're better than the rest of us?" she shot back. "Better than actors who actually care enough to speak up. That's pretty convenient, don't you think?" The audience shifted. Soft murmurs rolled through the studio like ripples across a still pond. People looked from Joy to Jason, sensing that something was spiraling far beyond the comfort zone of a daytime talk show. At the table, the other hosts exchanged quick, uneasy glances. Alyssa Farrah Griffin lifted her eyebrows in alarm. Sunny Hostin leaned back slightly, watching the exchange unfold with the caution of someone witnessing a runaway train. Even Sarah Haynes looked uncomfortable, glancing toward the producers offstage as if silently asking whether someone was going to intervene. Joy had cracked open a door, and instead of backing off, she was now kicking it wide open. Jason's expression changed again, barely but noticeably. His jaw tightened. His shoulders drew inward. The pleasant TV-friendly smile was long gone, replaced by something more serious, more human, more vulnerable. Whoopi Goldberg, who had been quiet up to this point, suddenly cleared her throat. It was the kind of throat, clear meant to redirect an entire conversation. Anyone who knew the show understood this was her attempt to pull things back from the brink. "All right," Whoopi began, her tone firm but diplomatic. "Let's talk about the actual show." But Joy cut her off. "No, Whoopi, I want to get clarity here," she insisted, leaning even closer to Jason. "If your show is dealing with political themes, then why shouldn't you? Why hide your beliefs? Why dodge the question?" Jason inhaled slowly, deeply, the kind of breath taken not for composure but for restraint. The tension in his face was now unmistakable. "Joy," he said, his voice lower, steadier, but unmistakably firmer, "I'm not hiding anything. I just choose not to make my personal political opinions the center of every conversation. I don't think viewers want actors telling them what to think." Joy scoffed again, louder this time, pushing harder. "That's the problem, Jason. People with influence should speak up. Silence just makes you complicit. You're telling me you have this massive platform, and you'd rather stay neutral. Sounds like you don't want to risk your fan base." Sarah Haynes blinked slowly. Alyssa shifted forward to speak, then stopped, sensing interrupting might make things worse. Sunny crossed her arms, watching with sharp curiosity, knowing something explosive was about to happen. The studio had fallen into a tense, breath-held silence. Every camera was locked on Jason. Every microphone was catching every breath. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to gasp, cringe, or brace for impact. Jason leaned forward in his seat, low, deliberate, controlled. His eyes locked onto Joy with a seriousness that made even the production crew stiffen. "Joy," he said quietly, "I didn't come here to be interrogated about my politics. I came here to talk about my work. You're turning this into something it doesn't need to be." Joy opened her mouth to fire back again, but Jason kept speaking, still calm, but with a firmness that cut straight through the air. "You want honesty, here it is," he continued. "I respect people who speak up, truly, but I also respect people who don't turn every project, every interview, every moment of their career into a political speech. Not everyone needs to shout their beliefs to prove they have them." A hush fell across the studio. A real hush, not awkward, not empty, but heavy. The kind of silence that happens right before a storm hits. Joy stared at him, visibly stunned that he had pushed back this directly. For the first time, it wasn't clear whether she had expected him to fold, or whether she had wanted him to snap, but the moment was unmistakable. Jason Bateman was done playing nice, and the interview was about to go somewhere no one on the panel, or in the audience, had anticipated. Whoopi interjected smoothly, her voice the verbal equivalent of a safety net. "Jason, can you tell us a little about the character development process for this role?" she asked, trying to pivot the conversation back to neutral territory before things spiraled completely off the rails. But Joy wasn't having it. She hadn't just asked a hard question. She had latched onto something, and everyone in that studio could see it. Joy Behar, once she sensed weakness or hesitation, was like a dog with a bone. And she wasn't about to drop this one. "No, wait," Joy said sharply, lifting her hand and effectively cutting off Whoopi mid-sentence. The gesture alone sent a ripple of discomfort across the table. "I think this is important." Her eyes locked on Jason with laser focus. "Jason," she continued, her tone thick with insinuation, "are you telling us that you think celebrities should just shut up and entertain? Because that sounds awfully familiar. Now, where have I heard that before?" It was a loaded statement, an attack disguised as a question, dripping with accusation. The implication was unmistakably clear, and undeniably insulting. A murmur passed through part of the audience, but it died instantly when Jason's expression shifted. His jaw tightened, so subtly that only the closest cameras caught it. But he kept his posture composed and his tone even. "I'm saying," Jason replied slowly, "that I respect my audience enough to let them form their own opinions without my influence." Each syllable was deliberate, careful, as if he were handling something fragile. "I think that's actually more respectful than assuming they need me to tell them how to think." Joy leaned back slightly, crossing her arms in open challenge. "Respectful," she repeated, her voice rising ever so slightly. "Or is it just cowardly?" The word hung in the air like the strike of a match in a room full of gasoline, and suddenly the temperature of the studio shifted. "I mean," Joy continued, her voice gaining momentum and volume, "when democracy is under attack, when people's rights are being stripped away, when the country is at a breaking point, don't you think silence is complicity? Don't you think staying neutral makes you part of the problem?" It was no longer an interview. It was an interrogation, and it was public. The studio had fallen completely, hauntingly silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, thick, almost physical. The audience, who moments earlier had been lightly whispering among each other, giggling at Jason's jokes, now sat frozen, eyes locked on the unfolding drama. Not a cough, not a whisper, not a shuffle of movement. Even the production crew had stopped everything. Camera operators stood motionless. Card assistants held their boards midair. The floor manager, who usually paced with headsets and hand signals, didn't move. Everyone was watching. You could almost hear the low, constant hum of the cameras, the overhead lights buzzing faintly, and the subtle shifting of microphones adjusting automatically to pick up every breath. Jason sat very still, too still. It was the stillness of a man forcing every muscle in his body not to react, not to snap, not to let the frustration boiling under his calm exterior take over. His eyes remained trained on Joy, his expression controlled but undeniably strained. He took a breath, slow, steady, calculated. "Joy," he said finally, his tone low and measured, "I'm an actor. I'm not a politician. I'm not an activist. I'm not an expert. I don't think it's my job to lecture millions of people about issues that are far more complicated than a soundbite." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but he continued, still calm, but firmer now, each word a tightly coiled thread of restraint. Some people use their platform to speak up. I respect that, he said. But other people choose to keep their work and their politics separate. That doesn't make them cowards. It makes them thoughtful. Joy scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes for the camera. Or it makes them scared to lose fans. She shot back. Let's be real. This time even the audience winced audibly. A few scattered gasps, a couple of soft "oh" reactions. The kind of noises people make when someone crosses a line, and everyone in the room knows it. Whoopi tried a second time. Okay, let's just... But Joy was already leaning forward again, gears turning, pushing harder, refusing to let go. The atmosphere was tense enough to snap. You could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone watching. Even the viewers at home would later comment that they felt the intensity through the screen. Jason blinked slowly, and for a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, you could see something in his eyes shift. A crack in the armor, the moment before emotional upheaval, the telltale sign that the calm, collected Jason Bateman, the world knew was dangerously close to disappearing. This was the breaking point. And everyone in the studio knew it.